The funeral was supposed to be quiet, a simple burial for a mother and child found dead in their own home. But just as the caskets were being lowered, a man in the back row stood up, and within seconds the cemetery turned into a crime scene. Screams, blood, 3 more bodies on the ground, and not a single person saw it coming. By the time the police arrived, the shooter hadn't even left the graveyard. But this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was something planned, calculated, personal. And when investigators traced the motive, what they uncovered behind closed doors was worse than the shooting itself. This story isn't about grief. It's about betrayal, and what one man did after realizing he never truly lost his family. They were taken from him, and what he did might make you question who the real monster was. It began like any small-town funeral. Hushed voices, folding chairs sinking slightly into damp grass, and 2 polished caskets glinting under a gray sky. 1 adult, 1 child. A mother and daughter laid side by side, victims of an unspeakable tragedy that had sent waves of grief through Whitmore's tightly knit suburban edge. Family members gathered close, holding tissues, holding each other. A pastor stood at the head of the grave plot, reading from a leather-bound book, his voice trembling between passages of comfort and unanswered questions. The little girl's photo sat framed on a small table between 2 bouquets, a toothy grin frozen in time, surrounded by lilies and soft rain. No one knew what to say anymore. Not really. The loss was too sudden, too brutal. The silence wasn't just respectful. It was heavy, suspicious, as if even nature itself was unsure whether this burial was a conclusion or the start of something darker. A slow wind passed through the cemetery trees. Then came the final prayers. People began to rise as the caskets were lowered. Heads bowed. Some clutched the earth in their hands, whispering last goodbyes. It was almost over, until it wasn't. Just as the second casket touched the bottom of the grave, 3 sharp cracks split the air. Not thunder, not car backfire, gunfire, controlled, clean, close. Screams erupted before anyone understood what was happening. Chairs tipped over. People hit the ground. A woman in black collapsed forward over the flowers, blood blooming across her back like a second dress. Another dropped to her knees beside her, her eyes wide and unblinking as a third shot spun her to the grass. Panic surged like a wave across the graveyard. The small crowd scattered, slipping on the wet ground, ducking behind headstones, grabbing for children, for phones, for anything. Then, silence again. Deafening, awful silence. When first responders arrived minutes later, the scene they walked into didn't resemble a burial. It looked like a war zone. 3 women, all from the same grieving family, lay dead within feet of the open graves. No one knew how many shots had been fired, but everyone remembered the man who fired them. He didn't run. He walked. Slowly, calmly, almost like he was waiting for something. Officers found him just beyond the cemetery gates, hands raised, weapon still warm in his waistband. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared past them, as if still listening for the sound of dirt falling on caskets. As investigators began piecing together who had been shot and who had pulled the trigger, the case stopped being about one family's tragedy and started unraveling into something far more disturbing. The funeral was never meant to bring closure. It was a trap, not for the killer, but for his grief. And what came next would force even seasoned detectives to admit they had never seen anything like this before. Not in Whitmore, not in 2012, and definitely not in the middle of a funeral. Before the graves, before the screaming, before the pistol was ever loaded. There was just a man trying to keep his family together. He wasn't the kind of man people noticed. Never loud, never dangerous, just quiet, steady, and hardworking. For nearly 9 years, he drove the same truck to the same job every morning, a maintenance position at a local manufacturing plant on the edge of town. Clock in, clock out. Rinse. Repeat. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the mortgage, kept food in the fridge, and gave his wife and daughter a stable life. Until the layoffs came. In October 2011, the factory downsized. A third of the crew was cut. His name was on the list. No severance, just a final paycheck and a box of tools. He told his wife he'd bounce back quickly. "Give me a few weeks," he said. "Something else will come." Weeks turned to months. Job interviews came and went. Rejection emails piled up. The bills didn't stop. Neither did the mortgage, the car note, the insurance, the school tuition. He tried everything: construction gigs, delivery shifts, even cash day labor jobs when he could find them. But it wasn't enough. Not in Whitmore. Not with rising costs and no safety net. The refrigerator grew emptier. So did the space between him and his wife. What began as quiet frustration turned to subtle resentment. She started spending more nights at her sister's house, sometimes not even returning until the next morning. The whispers turned into arguments. The warmth in their home faded faster than the heat from the broken furnace he couldn't afford to fix. Still, he stayed. Still, he tried. He stopped buying lunch for himself so his daughter wouldn't notice anything different. He sold his watch, then his tools. When he finally borrowed money from a neighbor, it wasn't for himself. It was to keep the lights on for 1 more month. No one knew how hard he was trying, because he never said. And when he finally did, no one was listening anymore. Not even his wife. By the holidays, the cracks became impossible to hide. She brought up separation, said she was tired of watching everything fall apart. He begged, told her they could figure it out, that things would change. He still believed they would. But the woman he once knew was already halfway out the door. And what he didn't know then, what he couldn't have known, was that someone else was already holding it open for her. In January 2012, she filed for divorce, cited irreconcilable differences, claimed the home was unstable, took their 8-year-old daughter with her. No custody battle, no long court fight, just signed paperwork, a moving truck, and silence. He was left behind in an empty house with nothing but bills and memories. Neighbors said he seemed quieter after that. A little thinner, a little more withdrawn, but he still mowed his lawn, still checked the mailbox, still left the porch light on, every night, just in case his daughter ever came back for a visit. She never did. By the time March rolled around, he was 3 months behind on the mortgage. Collection calls came daily. Friends stopped checking in. His phone stopped ringing entirely. And in the silence of that house, something inside him began to harden. Not violently, not suddenly, just slowly, like wet concrete left to dry. No one noticed the shift. No one asked how he was doing. Not her family, not her sisters, not even the woman who once promised to grow old with him. And so when the news finally came of what had happened to the girl he once read bedtime stories to, the world expected grief. But what they got was something else entirely. Nina didn't leave her husband overnight. It happened in pieces, over dinners, phone calls, and the kind of subtle conversations that sound like concern but carry judgment just beneath the surface. Her mother was the first to speak up. Deborah Payne had always carried herself like a woman who knew what was best. And in her mind, her daughter had married beneath her. She never said it outright, but it was always there. In the way she'd roll her eyes at Dwayne's beat-up truck, the way she referred to his job as that handyman thing, or how she'd ask Nina if she was really happy. Really? In that small rented home with bills on the counter and groceries measured by discount labels. Nina didn't argue at first. She'd just smile, brush it off. But she started listening. Then came her sisters. Erica and Jasmine were louder about it. Jasmine, the younger one, fresh off a breakup, believed no woman should suffer in silence, especially not for a man who couldn't provide. Erica, who had just married into money, viewed struggle as a choice. She didn't understand why Nina was still putting up with all that. They weren't cruel about it, not directly, just persistent. If he was the right man, Jasmine once said during a Sunday brunch, you wouldn't feel so exhausted all the time. It got worse after the layoff. When Dwayne lost his job, the conversations became more pointed. To them, it wasn't just unfortunate. It was unacceptable. Deborah offered to help Nina get back on her feet, even if it meant leaving the man she'd once built a life with. Erica suggested therapy. Jasmine made a joke about sending Nina on a weekend trip just to remember what it felt like to smile. It was around that time Nina started disappearing more often. Overnight visits at Erica's condo became weekly. She'd leave her daughter with her mother for long stretches, citing stress. Calls from Dwayne went unanswered. When she did speak to him, her voice was distant, flat. Unknown to him, there was someone else already circling the periphery. His name was Antoine, a friend of Jasmine's. She had introduced them casually at a birthday dinner, then again at a family cookout, and finally at a charity event where Nina showed up alone. Antoine was polite, well-dressed, charismatic. He asked the right questions, laughed at the right jokes. He owned a small contracting business out of town, drove a newer car, and spoke with the kind of confidence that made people listen. He told Nina she deserved better. He didn't pressure her. He just waited. By the time she finally said the words out loud, "I'm leaving him," her mother and sisters didn't ask questions. They helped pack the boxes. Jasmine even paid the first month's rent on a temporary apartment. A week later, Nina and her daughter moved into Antoine's home on the far side of Whitmore. A cleaner place, a newer place. She told friends it felt like a fresh start. She stopped answering Dwayne's calls entirely. To the people around her, it looked like progress. A woman escaping a dead marriage. A mother choosing stability. A family looking out for their own. But behind that picture was something else. None of them had asked why Antoine's past relationships ended. No one questioned how quickly he welcomed another woman and her child into his house. No one paused to wonder if the man who said all the right things might be hiding all the wrong ones. They were too busy celebrating what Nina had walked away from. They didn't see what she was walking into. Antoine Taylor had the kind of presence that made people trust him too quickly. Tall, clean-cut, and well-spoken, he wore success like a tailored suit. Neighbors saw him as a step up from Nina's struggling ex, a man who ran his own business, spoke with confidence, and kept his lawn trimmed. He wasn't flashy, but he gave just enough to suggest control, stability, direction. For the first few months, things were calm. Nina settled into the new house, a quiet split level tucked near the edge of a suburban cul-de-sac. Antoine took on a fatherly role to Janaya, helping with homework, offering rides to school. Nina's family visited often. Jasmine even called Antoine an answered prayer. But underneath the calm, there was history. His last two relationships had ended suddenly, with both women leaving town shortly after breaking up with him. Neither kept in touch with him. Neither spoke publicly about what went wrong. And that silence was deliberate. In his last marriage, barely 2 years before Nina moved in, police had been called to his home on 3 separate occasions. Once for a noise complaint that turned out to be shouting heard through the walls. Another time for suspected domestic disturbance. The third time, his then-wife had fled barefoot in the middle of the night to a neighbor's house, clutching her side and refusing to go back inside. She never filed formal charges, just left, disappeared. The pattern was eerily similar in the relationship before that. His ex-girlfriend, who once worked with him on a renovation project, left after just 8 months. Her sister later told officers that the woman had started sleeping with a knife under her pillow and wouldn't explain why. But none of that was on public record, at least not where Nina or her family could easily find it. And Antoine had a way of telling his side with precision. He'd say the exes were emotional, unstable, or had a history of exaggerating things. He never seemed angry about them, just disappointed, like a man who'd tried his best but was cursed to be misunderstood. Nina believed him. Why wouldn't she? By the time small signs started to surface, she was already too invested to pull back. The first serious argument happened over something as simple as a missed phone call. Antoine asked where she'd been. Nina laughed it off. He didn't. He kept asking. His voice didn't raise, but his tone changed. Cold. Clipped. Like a switch had flipped somewhere behind his eyes. Another time, she found the bathroom door cracked open after a shower. He said he'd only been checking to see if she was okay, but her towel was gone from the rack. The biggest red flag came late one night when he accused her of looking through his phone. She hadn't, but he didn't believe her. What started as a verbal confrontation escalated into shouts, a hole punched in the wall, and Nina backing into the corner of their bedroom with her daughter watching from the hallway. He apologized the next morning, said he was under stress, promised to do better, bought flowers, took them both out for pancakes. To outsiders, nothing seemed wrong, but Antoine's temper had a rhythm, a way of disappearing and returning just long enough to reset the damage. It wasn't daily, it wasn't predictable, but it was there. Always just under the surface, waiting. And Janaya, just 8 years old, had begun to sense it too. She avoided eye contact around him, grew quiet, restless. Still, Nina stayed. She told herself it was just tension, a rough patch, and her sisters, the same ones who once told her to leave her husband, reminded her she was finally with a man who had something going for him. But what no one could see yet, not her family, not her friends, not even Nina herself. Was that what Antoine had going for him? Was far more dangerous than anything Duane Reade ever lost. Janaya Reade was only 8, but she knew how to stay quiet when grown-ups argued. She had learned how to make herself small, how to sit still in corners, how to listen without being heard. Her laughter had faded months ago. Her drawings changed too, no longer full of rainbows or stars, but blank houses, figures with no faces, and girls without mouths. Teachers noticed she was no longer herself. Once an energetic child who volunteered to read aloud, she had become distant, sometimes flinching when touched on the shoulder. Her grades dropped. Her attendance became erratic. Some days she arrived late with puffy eyes and no explanation. Other days, she was absent entirely. When counselors tried to ask questions, she said nothing, just looked down and nodded. At home, the silence was worse. Antoine had shifted his attention from Nina to her daughter. The signs were there, but they came quietly, in changed routines, in the way Janaya began avoiding certain rooms, in the way she never wanted to be left alone. She no longer sang in the car. She no longer wanted to sleep in her own bed. When she came home from school, she'd go straight to her room and close the door. Not because she was angry, but because she didn't feel safe. Nina saw the changes. She told herself it was just a rough adjustment. New home, new school, a different environment. But deep down, something didn't sit right. There were times when Janaya looked at Antoine with a fear that didn't match anything a child should feel for an adult in her home. And yet, Nina stayed. Whether out of fear, denial, or desperation to make this new life work, she ignored the alarms. When her daughter cried at night and didn't say why, she brought her a glass of water and rubbed her back until she stopped shaking. When she found torn clothes and bloodstains and couldn't understand why, she assumed rough play. When bruises appeared where they shouldn't have, she convinced herself it must have been from a fall, even if Janaya didn't speak a word to confirm it. Meanwhile, Antoine was doing the most unthinkable devilish act with an innocent child. There were brief attempts to leave. Once, Nina packed a bag after a particularly aggressive outburst, but Antoine blocked the door. He never touched her in front of Janaya, but he didn't need to. His voice alone was enough to keep both of them in line. Behind closed doors, Janaya endured what no child should. She tried to tell her teacher once, half a sentence in the hallway. But then she froze and said it was nothing. She scribbled something once in the corner of a homework sheet that was too faint to read, but enough that the teacher flagged it. A welfare report was submitted to Child Services, but nothing came of it. No home visit, no interview. Another crack in the system swallowed her cry for help. And then it got worse. One night, the house erupted in screaming. It was loud enough for neighbors to hear through the walls. Nina had finally confronted Antoine. Words were exchanged, accusations made. He denied everything. Called the child names that would scar a soul far older than hers. When Nina slapped him, the last thread holding things together snapped. It was a Thursday night. There had already been an argument earlier that afternoon, something about money. Nina had noticed cash missing from her wallet. Janaya had mentioned quietly that Antoine had been opening her door at night. Something inside Nina snapped. She didn't scream this time. She asked questions, calmly, repeatedly. Antoine deflected, said the girl was confused, said Nina was becoming paranoid. When she didn't back down, his responses sharpened. By dinner time, they weren't speaking. Janaya ate alone in her room, a paper plate on her lap, the door closed. Around 9:40 p.m., neighbors heard the shouting again. Not the usual back and forth. This time it was louder, violent, furniture scraping, a crash. Then silence. What exactly happened inside that house over the next hour is known only by the killer. It was Monday morning when the call came in. A local elementary school reported a student absent for 2 days without any response from home. No returned calls, no pickup from daycare, no signed excuse notes, just silence. The child was 8-year-old Janaya Reed. Whitmore PD dispatched 2 officers for a routine welfare check. The house sat quiet at the end of a cul-de-sac. The grass was trimmed, the porch light was still on, despite the morning sun. One of the officers knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. Through the window, the living room looked undisturbed, but something didn't feel right. When one officer turned the doorknob, it opened easily. The front door hadn't been locked. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. A smell had begun to rise, not yet overpowering, but enough to put both officers on high alert. They announced themselves, hands on weapons, stepping carefully over a stack of unopened mail. The house was cold. The television was off. Nothing moved. Then they saw it. The living room rug was soaked dark red. Nearby, a woman's body lay collapsed on her side, skin pale, jaw clenched, blood dried in thick, rust-colored streaks across the floor. Her eyes were open, her hands curled in rigid defense. There were signs of a struggle: broken glass, an overturned lamp, smears on the wall. They called it in immediately. Confirmed homicide. One victim, possibly more inside. Backup arrived minutes later. When they pushed into the master bedroom, they found the second body, a child, curled beneath a blanket as if tucked in. No movement, no breathing, no saving. The scene was sealed within the hour. Paramedics didn't rush. There was nothing to revive. Investigators from Whitmore County's Major Crimes Unit arrived shortly after, securing the perimeter with tape and stationing an officer at the front porch to redirect onlookers. 2 bodies in the same home, a mother and her daughter. Police would not release names yet, but neighbors already suspected. The woman who had just moved in a few months ago, the little girl who had waved from the window each morning, that quiet, friendly new family. Detectives interviewed the nearest neighbors. Some mentioned loud arguments days earlier. One recalled hearing a scream, but thought it was from the television. No one called the police at the time. No one stepped in. Back at the department, fingerprints were lifted. Statements gathered. A bolo was issued for the man believed to have lived with them, Antoine Taylor. But while investigators launched a manhunt, one other person heard the news in a way that didn't require explanation. Dwayne Reed had not spoken to Nina in months. He hadn't seen his daughter since the custody change. But when a former neighbor called and told him that police were swarming her house, he knew. He didn't need confirmation. He didn't wait for authorities to notify him. He didn't cry, not at first. He called no one. Not his mother. Not a friend. He didn't ask for help, because something inside him had already fractured. For investigators, it was another brutal case of domestic violence turned deadly. For the public, it was a tragedy. For Nina's family, it was a moment of unbearable reckoning. But for Dwayne, it was the exact moment his world collapsed. The final blow in a year of silent destruction. He had lost his marriage. He had lost his child. Now he had nothing left. And no one, not even the police, knew what that kind of grief might eventually turn into. The day before the funeral felt heavier than it should have. The sky hung low, overcast, with the kind of breeze that moved without direction. There were no birds chirping. No children playing in the street. Just slow cars, lowered voices, and a town unsure how to mourn 2 people at once. Nina and Jania's bodies were released to the family after the post-mortem. Though Antoine Taylor was still on the run, the police had cleared the scene and confirmed there were no remaining suspects within the household. Officially, it was safe to proceed with burial. Unofficially, there was tension. Because while the community saw this as a tragedy, some officers whispered what others wouldn't say out loud, that there was more to come. Antoine hadn't been caught. The motive for the murders wasn't fully public. And there were whispers that the girl's biological father, Dwayne Reed, had been spotted near the station days earlier, not asking questions, just sitting silently in his truck. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. A dual ceremony, closed casket, private burial at Greenridge Memorial, a small, neatly kept cemetery on the edge of Whitmore's suburban line, the same place Nina's father had been buried years ago. The family had decided to lay mother and daughter side by side. Deborah Payne, Nina's mother, made all the arrangements. She handled everything with the efficiency of someone in charge. Floral orders, obituary notices, catering for the repass. She declined media requests. She ignored speculation. She told those closest to her that justice would come when Antoine was found, and until then, they needed to grieve with dignity. But dignity didn't hold up well behind closed doors. At the family's home that Friday, tensions simmered. Erica Payne and Jasmine Payne, Nina's sisters, hadn't slept much. They were angry, defensive. Jasmine blamed the police for not catching Antoine sooner. Erica blamed Nina's poor judgment. Both had avoided mentioning Duane entirely, though his name lingered in every pause. That evening, final preparations were made. The caskets were delivered to the funeral home. Programs were printed. The family gathered to view the bodies one last time before the public ceremony. It was quiet, controlled. But something about the moment didn't feel still. When officers asked if additional security was needed for the funeral, Deborah declined. "He's not going to show his face," she said, when Duane's name was mentioned. "He lost the right to grieve when he walked out of her life." No one challenged her, not even the officer who gently reminded her that Duane hadn't walked. He had been left. Still, the plan remained the same. No police presence, just family, a few friends, a brief service, and then peace. Across town, Duane sat in his car outside a gas station. He had already driven by the cemetery twice, not close enough to be noticed, but near enough to see where the tents were being set up. The folding chairs, the platform for the caskets. No one looked for him. No one expected him. He hadn't said goodbye. Not at the morgue, not at the funeral home, not even to the few people who still remembered his name in that town. But he was coming. Because sometimes funerals bury more than just bodies. Sometimes they unearth what silence tried to hide. By mid-morning, the burial ground at Green Ridge Memorial had filled with somber bodies in dark clothing. The wind stirred gently through the rows of polished headstones as two matching caskets were rolled toward the open graves. One was slightly smaller than the other. White roses had been arranged into heart-shaped wreaths. A local pastor stood near a small podium, flipping pages slowly, waiting for the signal to begin. Nina's mother stood with her daughters, Erica and Jasmine, just a few feet from the edge of the burial site. Between them sat a framed photo of Janiyah in her school uniform, held by one of the cousins. A child's laugh broke the silence for a moment, then faded. The ceremony began. The ex-husband arrived quietly. No one saw which car he came in. He didn't walk with family, didn't sit among the rows of white chairs. He stood in the back, just beyond the line of sight, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. A few attendees glanced at him, but no one reacted. To most, he looked like a distant relative, another mourner. He stayed silent through the prayers, through the hymns, through the reading of Psalm 23. He only moved when the caskets began to lower. 3 steps forward. Slow. Unhurried. His right hand disappeared into his jacket. The first shot hit Deborah Payne just beneath her shoulder blade, sending her collapsing onto the grass without a sound. The second shot struck Jasmine as she turned in shock. The impact lifted her halfway off the ground before she crumpled beside her mother. Screams filled the air. Folding chairs clattered to the ground. People scattered in all directions. Erica tried to run. She didn't make it 5 steps before the third shot caught her between the shoulder blades. She dropped instantly. Panic surged. Several attendees fell to the ground in reflex, hands covering their heads. The pastor ducked behind the podium. Children cried. Phones were fumbled for. But by the time someone shouted for the police, the shooter had already turned and walked away. He didn't rush. He didn't hide the gun. He walked the same path he had entered from, through the trees, and past the final row of graves, disappearing behind a black utility shed near the back fence line. The first officer arrived within 4 minutes. The second followed seconds later. Within 6 minutes of the first shot, the cemetery was surrounded. They found him not far from the gates. Duane Reade was standing still near the back entrance, hands in the air, Glock on the ground beside him. He said nothing. Didn't resist. Didn't cry. When officers cuffed him, he looked past them, his eyes fixed on the spot where his daughter had just been buried. He didn't ask about the victims. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't try to justify anything. He had done exactly what he came to do. Inside his car, parked discreetly at a side entrance, officers found a folded note with no signature. It contained only 3 lines. They sent her there. They knew. I begged. No one listened. The trial of Duane Reade began 3 months after the cemetery shooting. By then, Antoine Taylor had been captured in Arkansas during a routine traffic stop, charged with 2 counts of murder and multiple other felonies. As for Duane, the courtroom was packed for every session. Seats filled before the doors opened, reporters jostled for position. Protesters stood outside, some holding signs that called him a hero, others demanding accountability. The facts were never in question. He had brought the weapon. He had pulled the trigger. He had chosen each of the 3 women with chilling precision. The prosecution focused on that, on the planning, the calculated approach, the absence of remorse. They showed the footage from the cemetery, played the audio from 911 calls. They framed it not as grief, but premeditated rage. The defense told a different story. They called him broken, a father shattered by loss, a man who had pleaded, been ignored, and then forced to bury his only child because of decisions made by the very women he later targeted. They introduced the note found in his vehicle. They brought in old messages he'd sent months before, text messages asking for visitation, warning about the man his daughter had been living with, emails that had gone unanswered. Duane never testified, but his silence said more than any words might have. When the jury returned, it was swift. Guilty on all counts. 3 counts of murder. 1 illegal firearm charge. Life without the possibility of parole. Some cheered the verdict. Others wept. Outside the courthouse, debate continued long after the courtroom lights dimmed. To many, Duane Reade was a murderer, one who stole the lives of 3 women at a funeral, turning mourning into carnage. But to others, he was a grieving father pushed to the edge by a system that failed him and a family that never gave him a voice. What never made headlines were the quiet conversations. The teachers who said the child had tried to speak up. The neighbors who heard things and said nothing. The relatives who admitted, behind closed doors, that maybe, just maybe, they had pushed Nina too far in the wrong direction. But understanding doesn't change reality. 4 women were dead. A child was gone. 2 men were in prison. And a family had collapsed under the weight of its own choices. By the end of 2012, the graves at Green Ridge Memorial had settled. Grass had grown over the soil. New flowers had been placed. But the pain hadn't faded. Years later, the question still lingers. Was it justice? Or just another tragedy where everyone was too late? In the end, no one walked away innocent. And sometimes, the loudest crimes begin with the silence no one dared to break.